Chapter 13 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 13. Racing for Life. At last the sea subsided, and we were able to get a better view of the armada of small boats in our wake. There must have been 200 of them. Juog said that he had never seen so many boats before in all his life. Where had they come from? Juog was first to hazard a guess. "Hooja," he said, "was building many boats to carry his warriors to the great river and up it toward Sari. He was building them with almost all his warriors and many slaves upon the island of trees. No one else in all the history of Pellucidar has ever built so many boats as they told me Hooja was building. These must be Hooja's boats." "And they were blown out to sea by the great storm, just as we were," suggested Diane. "There can be no better explanation of them," I agreed. "What shall we do?" asked Juog. "Suppose we make sure that they are really Hooja's people," suggested Diane. "It may be that they are not, and that if we run away from them before we learn definitely who they are, we shall be running away from a chance to live and find the mainland. They may be a people of whom we have never even heard, and if so, we can ask them to help us, if they know the way to the mainland." "Which they will not," interposed Juog. "Well," I said, "it can't make our predicament any more trying to wait until we find out who they are. They are heading for us now. Evidently they have spied our sail and guess that we do not belong to their fleet." "They probably want to ask the way to the mainland themselves," said Juog, who was nothing if not a pessimist. "If they want to catch us, they can do it if they can paddle faster than we can sail," I said. "If we let them come close enough to discover their identity, and can then sail faster than they can paddle, we can get away from them anyway, so we might as well wait." And wait we did. The sea calmed rapidly, so that by the time the foremost canoe had come within 500 yards of us, we could see them all plainly. Every one was headed for us. The dugouts, which were of unusual length, were manned by 20 paddlers, 10 to a side. Beside the paddlers there were 25 or more warriors in each boat. When the leader was 100 yards from us, Diane called our attention to the fact that several of her crew were Sagoths. That convinced us that the flotilla was indeed Hooja's. I told Juog to hail them and get what information he could, while I remained in the bottom of our canoe as much out of sight as possible. Diane lay down at full length in the bottom. I did not want them to see and recognize her if they were in truth Hooja's people. "Who are you?" shouted Juog, standing up in the boat and making a megaphone of his palms. A figure arose in the bow of the leading canoe, a figure that I was sure I recognized even before he spoke. "I am Hooja," cried the man in answer to Juog. For some reason he did not recognize his former prisoner and slave, possibly because he had so many of them. "I come from the island of trees," he continued. "100 of my boats were lost in the great storm, and all their crews drowned. Where is the land? What are you, and what strange thing is that which flutters from the little tree in the front of your canoe?" He referred to our sail, flapping idly in the wind. "We too are lost," replied Juog. "We know not where the land is. We are going back to look for it now." So saying, he commenced to scull the canoe's nose before the wind, while I made fast the primitive sheets that held our crude sail. We thought it time to be going. There wasn't much wind at the time, and the heavy, lumbering dugout was slow in getting under way. I thought it never would gain any momentum. And all the while Hooja's canoe was drawing rapidly nearer, propelled by the strong arms of his 20 paddlers. Of course their dugout was much larger than ours, and consequently infinitely heavier and more cumbersome. Nevertheless, it was coming along at quite a clip, and ours was yet but barely moving. Diane and I remained out of sight as much as possible, for the two craft were now well within bowshot of one another, and I knew that Hooja had archers. Hooja called to Juag to stop when he saw that our craft was moving. He was much interested in the sail, and not a little awed, as I could tell by his shouted remarks and questions. Raising my head, I saw him plainly. He would have made an excellent target for one of my guns, and I had never been sorrier that I had lost them. We were now picking up speed a trifle, and he was not gaining upon us so fast as at first. In consequence, his requests that we stop suddenly changed to commands as he became aware that we were trying to escape him. "Come back!" he shouted. "Come back, or I'll fire!" I use the word fire because it more nearly translates into English the Pellucidarian word trag, which covers the launching of any deadly missile. But Juag only seized his paddle more tightly, the paddle that answered the purpose of rudder, and commenced to assist the wind by vigorous strokes. Then Hooja gave the command to some of his archers to fire upon us. I couldn't lie hidden in the bottom of the boat, leaving Juag alone exposed to the deadly shafts, so I arose and seizing another paddle set to work to help him. Diane joined me, though I did my best to persuade her to remain sheltered; but being a woman, she must have her own way. The instant that Hooja saw us, he recognized us. The whoop of triumph he raised indicated how certain he was that we were about to fall into his hands. A shower of arrows fell about us. Then Hooja caused his men to cease firing. He wanted us alive. None of the missiles struck us, for Hooja's archers were not nearly the marksmen that are my Sarians and Amazight's. We had now gained sufficient headway to hold our own on about even terms with Hooja's paddlers. We did not seem to be gaining, though, and neither did they. How long this nerve-wracking experience lasted, I cannot guess, though we had pretty nearly finished our meager supply of provisions when the wind picked up a bit, and we commenced to draw away. Not once yet had we sighted land, nor could I understand it, since so many of the seas I had seen before were thickly dotted with islands. Our plight was anything but pleasant, yet I think that Hooja and his forces were even worse off than we, for they had no food nor water at all. Far out behind us, in a long line that curved upward in the distance, to be lost in the haze, strung Hooja's 200 boats; but one would have been enough to have taken us could it have come alongside. We had drawn some 50 yards ahead of Hooja. There had been times when we were scarce 10 yards in advance, and were feeling considerably safer from capture. Hooja's men, working in relays, were commencing to show the effects of the strain under which they had been forced to work without food or water, and I think their weakening aided us almost as much as the slight freshening of the wind. Hooja must have commenced to realize that he was going to lose us, for he again gave orders that we be fired upon. Volley after volley of arrows struck about us. The distance was so great by this time that most of the arrows fell short, while those that reached us were sufficiently spent to allow us to ward them off with our paddles. However, it was a most exciting ordeal. Hooja stood in the bow of his boat, alternately urging his men to greater speed and shouting epithets at me. But we continued to draw away from him. At last the wind rose to a fair gale, and we simply raced away from our pursuers as if they were standing still. Juag was so tickled that he forgot all about his hunger and thirst. I think that he had never been entirely reconciled to the heathenish invention which I called a sail, and that down in the bottom of his heart he believed that the paddlers would eventually overhaul us. But now he couldn't praise it enough. We had a strong gale for a considerable time, and eventually dropped Hooja's fleet so far astern that we could no longer discern them. And then, I shall never forget that moment, Diane sprang to her feet with a cry of "Land!" Sure enough, dead ahead, a long, low coast stretched across our bow. It was still a long way off, and we couldn't make out whether it was island or mainland, but at least it was land. If ever shipwrecked mariners were grateful, we were then. Raja and Rene were commencing to suffer for lack of food, and I could swear that the latter often cast hungry glances upon us, though I am equally sure that no such hideous thoughts ever entered the head of her mate. We watched them both most closely, however. Once, while stroking Rene, I managed to get a rope around her neck and make her fast to the side of the boat. Then I felt a bit safer for Diane. It was pretty close quarters in that little dugout for three human beings and two practically wild, man-eating dogs, but we had to make the best of it, since I would not listen to Juag's suggestion that we kill and eat Roger and Rene. We made good time to within a few miles of the shore. Then the wind died suddenly out. We were all of us keyed up to such a pitch of anticipation that the blow was doubly hard to bear. And it was a blow, too, since we could not tell in what quarter the wind might rise again. But Juag and I set to work to paddle the remaining distance. Almost immediately the wind rose again from precisely the opposite direction from which it had formerly blown, so that it was mighty hard work making progress against it. Next it veered again, so that we had to turn and run with it parallel to the coast to keep from being swamped in the trough of the seas. And while we were suffering all these disappointments, Hooja's fleet appeared in the distance. They evidently had gone far to the left of our course, for they were now almost behind us as we ran parallel to the coast. But we were not much afraid of being overtaken in the wind that was blowing. The gale kept on increasing, but it was fitful, swooping down upon us in great gusts and then going almost calm for an instant. It was after one of these momentary calms that the catastrophe occurred. Our sail hung limp, and our momentum decreased, when of a sudden a particularly vicious squall caught us. Before I could cut the sheets, the mast had snapped at the thwart in which it was stepped. The worst had happened. Juag and I seized paddles and kept the canoe with the wind, but that squall was the parting shot of the gale, which died out immediately after, leaving us free to make for the shore, which we lost no time in attempting. But Hooja had drawn closer in toward shore than we, so it looked as if he might head us off before we could land. However, we did our best to distance him, Diane taking a paddle with us. We were in a fair way to succeed when there appeared, pouring from among the trees beyond the beach, a horde of yelling, painted savages, brandishing all sorts of devilish-looking primitive weapons. So menacing was their attitude that we realized at once the folly of attempting to land among them. Hooja was drawing closer to us. There was no wind. We could not hope to out-paddle him, and with our sail gone, no wind would help us, though, as if in derision at our plight, a steady breeze was now blowing. But we had no intention of sitting idle while our fate overtook us, so we bent to our paddles and, keeping parallel with the coast, did our best to pull away from our pursuers. It was a grueling experience. We were weakened by lack of food. We were suffering the pangs of thirst. Capture and death were close at hand. Yet I think that we gave a good account of ourselves in our final effort to escape. Our boat was so much smaller and lighter than any of Hooja's that the three of us forced it ahead almost as rapidly as his larger craft could go under their 20 paddles. As we raced along the coast for one of those seemingly interminable periods that may draw hours into eternities, where the labor is soul-searing and there is no way to measure time, I saw what I took for the opening to a bay or the mouth of a great river a short distance ahead of us. I wished that we might make for it, but with the menace of Hooja close behind and the screaming natives who raced along the shore parallel to us, I dared not attempt it. We were not far from shore in that mad flight from death. Even as I paddled, I found opportunity to glance occasionally toward the natives. They were white, but hideously painted. From their gestures and weapons, I took them to be a most ferocious race. I was rather glad that we had not succeeded in landing among them. Hooja's fleet had been in much more compact formation when we sighted them this time than on the occasion following the tempest. Now they were moving rapidly in pursuit of us, all well within the radius of a mile. 5 of them were leading, all abreast, and were scarce 200 yards from us. When I glanced over my shoulder, I could see that the archers had already fitted arrows to their bows in readiness to fire upon us the moment that they should draw within range. Hope was low in my breast. I could not see the slightest chance of escaping them, for they were overhauling us rapidly now, since they were able to work their paddles in relays, while we three were rapidly wearying beneath the constant strain that had been put upon us. It was then that Juag called my attention to the rift in the shoreline which I had thought either a bay or the mouth of a great river. There I saw moving slowly out into the sea that which filled my soul with wonder. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 14. Gore and Dreams. It was a two-masted felucca with lateen sails. The craft was long and low. In it were more than 50 men, 20 or 30 of whom were at oars with which the craft was being propelled from the lee of the land. I was dumbfounded. Could it be that the savage, painted natives I had seen on shore had so perfected the art of navigation that they were masters of such advanced building and rigging as this craft proclaimed? It seemed impossible. As I looked, I saw another of the same type swing into view and follow its sister through the narrow strait out into the ocean. Nor were these all. One after another, following closely upon one another's heels, came 50 of the trim, graceful vessels. They were cutting in between Hooge's fleet and our little dugout. When they came a bit closer, my eyes fairly popped from my head at what I saw, for in the eye of the leading felucca stood a man with a sea glass level upon us. Who could they be? Was there a civilization within Pellucidar of such wondrous advancement as this? Were there far distant lands of which none of my people had ever heard, where a race had so greatly outstripped all other races of this inner world? The man with the glass had lowered it and was shouting to us. I could not make out his words, but presently I saw that he was pointing aloft. When I looked, I saw a pennant fluttering from the peak of the forward lateen yard, a red, white, and blue pennant, with a single great white star in a field of blue. Then I knew. My eyes went even wider than they had before. It was the navy! It was the navy of the empire of Pellucidar, which I had instructed Perry to build in my absence. It was my navy. I dropped my paddle and stood up and shouted and waved my hand. Juag and Diane looked at me as if I had gone suddenly mad. When I could stop shouting, I told them, and they shared my joy and shouted with me. But still Hooja was coming nearer, nor could the leading felucca overhaul him before he would be alongside or at least within bowshot. Hooja must have been as much mystified as we were as to the identity of the strange fleet, but when he saw me waving to them, he evidently guessed that they were friendly to us, so he urged his men to redouble their efforts to reach us before the felucca cut him off. He shouted word back to others of his fleet, word that was passed back until it had reached them all, directing them to run alongside the strangers and board them, for with his 200 craft and his 8 or 10,000 warriors, he evidently felt equal to overcoming the 50 vessels of the enemy, which did not seem to carry over 3,000 men all told. His own personal energies he bent to reaching Diane and me first, leaving the rest of the work to his other boats. I thought that there could be little doubt that he would be successful in so far as we were concerned, and I feared for the revenge that he might take upon us should the battle go against his force, as I was sure it would, for I knew that Perry and his Mezops must have brought with them all the arms and ammunition that had been contained in the prospector. But I was not prepared for what happened next. As Hooge's canoe reached a point some 20 yards from us, a great puff of smoke broke from the bow of the leading felucca, followed almost simultaneously by a terrific explosion, and a solid shot screamed close over the heads of the men in Hooge's craft, raising a great splash where it clove the water just beyond them. Perry had perfected gunpowder and built cannon. It was marvelous. Diane and Juag, as much surprised as Hooja, turned wondering eyes toward me. Again the cannon spoke. I suppose that by comparison with the great guns of modern naval vessels of the outer world, it was a pitifully small and inadequate thing, but here in Pellucidar, where it was the first of its kind, It was about as awe-inspiring as anything you might imagine. With the report, an iron cannon ball about 5 inches in diameter struck Hoja's dugout just above the waterline, tore a great splintering hole in its side, turned it over, and dumped its occupants into the sea. The 4 dugouts that had been abreast of Hooja had turned to intercept the leading felucca. Even now, in the face of what must have been a withering catastrophe to them, they kept bravely on toward the strange and terrible craft. In them were fully 200 men, while but 50 lined the gunwale of the felucca to repel them. The commander of the felucca, who proved to be Ja, let them come quite close and then turned loose upon them a volley of shots from small arms. The cave men and Sagos in the dugouts seemed to wither before that blast of death like dry grass before a prairie fire. Those who were not hit dropped their bows and javelins, and seizing upon paddles attempted to escape. But the felucca pursued them relentlessly, her crew firing at will. At last I heard Ja shouting to the survivors in the dugouts, they were all quite close to us now, offering them their lives if they would surrender. Perry was standing close behind Ja, and I knew that this merciful action was prompted, perhaps commanded, by the old man, for no Pellucidarian would have thought of showing leniency to a defeated foe. As there was no alternative save death, the survivors surrendered, and a moment later were taken aboard the Amos, the name that I could now see printed in large letters upon the felucca's bow, and which no one in that whole world could read except Perry and I. When the prisoners were aboard, Ja brought the felucca alongside our dugout. Many were the willing hands that reached down to lift us to her decks. The bronze faces of the Mezops were broad with smiles, and Perry was fairly beside himself with joy. Diane went aboard first, and then Juag, as I wished to help Raja and Rene aboard myself, well knowing that it would fare ill with any Mezop who touched them. We got them aboard at last, and a great commotion they caused among the crew, who had never seen a wild beast thus handled by man before. Perry and Diane and I were so full of questions that we fairly burst, but we had to contain ourselves for a while, since the battle with the rest of Hooja's fleet had scarce commenced. From the small forward decks of the feluccas, Perry's crude cannon were belching smoke, flame, thunder and death. The air trembled to the roar of them. Hooja's horde, intrepid, savage fighters that they were closing in to grapple in a last death struggle with the Mezops who manned our vessels. The handling of our fleet by the Red Island warriors of Ja's clan was far from perfect. I could see that Perry had lost no time after the completion of the boats in setting out upon this cruise. What little the captains and crews had learned of handling feluccas they must have learned principally since they embarked upon this voyage, and while experience is an excellent teacher and had done much for them, they still had a great deal to learn. In maneuvering for position they were continually fouling one another, and on 2 occasions shots from our batteries came near to striking our own ships. No sooner, however, was I aboard the flagship than I attempted to rectify this trouble to some extent. By passing commands by word of mouth from one ship to another, I managed to get the 50 feluccas into some sort of line, with the flagship in the lead. In this formation we commenced slowly to circle the position of the enemy. The dugouts came for us right along in an attempt to board us, but by keeping on the move in one direction and circling, we managed to avoid getting in each other's way, and were enabled to fire our cannon and small arms with less danger to our own comrades. When I had a moment to look about me, I took in the felucca on which I was. I am free to confess that I marveled at the excellent construction and staunch yet speedy lines of the little craft. That Perry had chosen this type of vessel seemed rather remarkable, for though I had warned him against turreted battleships, armor, and like useless show, I had fully expected that when I beheld his navy I should find considerable attempt at grim and terrible magnificence, for it was always Perry's idea to overawe these ignorant cave-men when we had to contend with them in battle. But I had soon learned that while one might easily astonish them with some new engine of war, it was an utter impossibility to frighten them into surrender. I learned later that Ja had gone carefully over the plans of various craft with Perry. The old man had explained in detail all that the text told him of them. The two had measured out dimensions upon the ground, that Ja might see the sizes of different boats. Perry had built models, and Ja had had him read carefully and explain all that they could find relative to the handling of sailing vessels. The result of this was that Ja was the one who had chosen the felucca. It was well that Perry had had so excellent a balance wheel, for he had been wild to build a huge frigate of the Nelsonian era. He told me so himself. One thing that had inclined Ja particularly to the felucca was the fact that it included oars in its equipment. He realized the limitations of his people in the matter of sails, and while they had never used oars, the implement was so similar to a paddle that he was sure they quickly could master the art, and they did. As soon as one hull was completed, Ja kept it on the water constantly, first with one crew and then with another, until 2,000 red warriors had learned to row. Then they stepped their masts, and a crew was told off for the first ship. While the others were building, they learned to handle theirs. As each succeeding boat was launched, its crew took it out and practiced with it under the tutorage of those who had graduated from the first ship, and so on until a full complement of men had been trained for every boat. Well, to get back to the battle. The Houyhnhnms kept on coming at us, and as fast as they came, we mowed them down. It was little else than slaughter. Time and time again I cried to them to surrender, promising them their lives if they would do so. At last there were but 10 boatloads left. These turned in flight. They thought they could paddle away from us. It was pitiful. I passed the word from boat to boat to cease firing, not to kill another Houyhnhnm unless they fired on us. Then we set out after them. There was a nice little breeze blowing, and we bowled along after our quarry as gracefully and as lightly as swans upon a park lagoon. As we approached them, I could see not only wonder but admiration in their eyes. I hailed the nearest dugout. "Throw down your arms and come aboard us," I cried, "and you shall not be harmed. We will feed you and return you to the mainland. Then you shall go free upon your promise never to bear arms against the Emperor of Pellucidar again." I think it was the promise of food that interested them most. They could scarce believe that we would not kill them. But when I exhibited the prisoners we already had taken, and showed them that they were alive and unharmed, a great Sagoth in one of the boats asked me what guarantee I could give that I would keep my word. "None other than my word," I replied. "That I do not break." The Pellucidarians themselves are rather punctilious about this same matter, so the Sagoth could understand that I might possibly be speaking the truth. But he could not understand why we should not kill them unless we meant to enslave them, which I had as much as denied already when I had promised to set them free. Ja couldn't exactly see the wisdom of my plan either. He thought that we ought to follow up the 10 remaining dugouts and sink them all. But I insisted that we must free as many as possible of our enemies upon the mainland. "You see," I explained, "these men will return at once to Hooge's Island, to the Mahar cities from which they come, or to the countries from which they were stolen by the Mahars. They are men of 2 races and of many countries. They will spread the story of our victory far and wide, and while they are with us we will let them see and hear many other wonderful things which they may carry back to their friends and their chiefs. It's the finest chance for free publicity, Perry," I added to the old man, "that you or I have seen in many a day." Perry agreed with me. As a matter of fact, he would have agreed to anything that would have restrained us from killing the poor devils who fell into our hands. He was a great fellow to invent gunpowder and firearms and cannon, but when it came to using these things to kill people, he was as tender-hearted as a chicken. The Sagoth who had spoken was talking to other Sagoths in his boat. Evidently they were holding a council over the question of the wisdom of surrendering. "What will become of you if you don't surrender to us?" I asked. "If we do not open our batteries on you again and kill you all, you will simply drift about the sea helplessly until you die of thirst and starvation. You cannot return to the islands, for you have seen as well as we that the natives there are very numerous and warlike. they would kill you the moment you landed. The upshot of it was that the boat of which the Sagoth speaker was in charge surrendered. The Sagoths threw down their weapons, and we took them aboard the ship next in line behind the Amahs. First Ja had to impress upon the captain and crew of the ship that the prisoners were not to be abused or killed. After that the remaining dugouts paddled up and surrendered. We distributed them among the entire fleet lest there be too many upon any one vessel. Thus ended the first real naval engagement that the Pellucidarian seas had ever witnessed, though Perry still insists that the action in which the Sari took part was a battle of the first magnitude. The battle over and the prisoners disposed of and fed, and do not imagine that Diane, Juag, and I, as well as the two hounds, were not fed also, I turned my attention to the fleet. We had the feluccas close in about the flagship, and with all the ceremony of a medieval potentate on parade, I received the commanders of the 49 feluccas that accompanied the flagship, Diane and I together, the Empress and the Emperor of Pellucidar. It was a great occasion. The savage bronze warriors entered into the spirit of it, for as I learned later, dear old Perry had left no opportunity neglected for impressing upon them that David was Emperor of Pellucidar, and that all that they were accomplishing and all that he was accomplishing was due to the power and redounded to the glory of David. The old man must have rubbed it in pretty strong, for those fierce warriors nearly came to blows in their efforts to be among the first of those to kneel before me and kiss my hand. When it came to kissing Diane's, I think they enjoyed it more. I know I should have. A happy thought occurred to me as I stood upon the little deck of the Amahs, with the first of Perry's primitive cannon behind me. When John kneeled at my feet, and first to do me homage, I drew from its scabbard at his side the sword of hammered iron that Perry had taught him to fashion. Striking him lightly on the shoulder, I created him king of Anarok. Each captain of the 49 other feluccas I made a duke. I left it to Perry to enlighten them as to the value of the honors I had bestowed upon them. During these ceremonies, Raja and Renee had stood beside Diane and me. Their bellies had been well filled, but still they had difficulty in permitting so much edible humanity to pass unchallenged. It was a good education for them, though, and never after did they find it difficult to associate with the human race without arousing their appetites. After the ceremonies were over, we had a chance to talk with Perry and Ja. The former told me that Gok, king of Sari, had sent my letter and map to him by a runner, and that he and Ja had at once decided to set out on the completion of the fleet to ascertain the correctness of my theory that the Laurel Az, in which the Anarok Islands lay, was in reality the same ocean as that which lapped the shores of Thuria under the name of Sojar Az, or Great Sea. Their destination had been the island retreat of Hooja, and they had sent word to Gok of their plans that we might work in harmony with them. The tempest that had blown us off the coast of the continent had blown them far to the south also. Shortly before discovering us, they had come into a great group of islands, from between the largest two of which they were sailing when they saw Hooja's fleet pursuing our dugout. I asked Perry if he had any idea as to where we were or in what direction lay Hooja's island or the continent. He replied by producing his map, on which he had carefully marked the newly discovered islands. They are described as the Unfriendly Isles, which showed Hooja's island northwest of us, about 2 points west. He then explained that with compass, chronometer, log, and reel they had kept a fairly accurate record of their course from the time they had set out. 4 of the feluccas were equipped with these instruments, and all of the captains had been instructed in their use. I was very greatly surprised at the ease with which these savages had mastered the rather intricate detail of this unusual work, but Perry assured me that they were a wonderfully intelligent race and had been quick to grasp all that he had tried to teach them. Another thing that surprised me was the fact that so much had been accomplished in so short a time, for I could not believe that I had been gone from Anarok for a sufficient period to permit of building a fleet of 50 feluccas and mining iron ore for the cannon and balls, to say nothing of manufacturing these guns and the crude muzzle-loading rifles with which every Mezop was armed, as well as the gunpowder and ammunition they had in such ample quantities. "Time!" exclaimed Perry. "Well, how long were you gone from Anarok before we picked you up in the So-jour-Az?" That was a puzzler, and I had to admit it. I didn't know how much time had elapsed, and neither did Perry, for time is non-existent in Pellucidar. "Then you see, David," he continued, "I had almost unbelievable resources at my disposal. The Mezops inhabiting the Anarok Islands, which stretch far out to sea beyond the 3 principal isles with which you are familiar, number well into the millions, and by far the greater part of them are friendly to Ja. Men, women, and children turned to and worked the moment Ja explained the nature of our enterprise. And not only were they anxious to do all in their power to hasten the day when the Mahars should be overthrown, but, and this counted for most of all, they are simply ravenous for greater knowledge and for better ways of doing things. The contents of the prospector set their imaginations to working overtime, so that they craved to own themselves the knowledge which had made it possible for other men to create and build the things which you brought back from the outer world. And then," continued the old man, "the element of time, or rather lack of time, operated to my advantage. There being no nights, there was no laying off from work. They labored incessantly, stopping only to eat, and on rare occasions to sleep. Once we had discovered iron ore, we had enough mined in an incredibly short time to build 1,000 cannon. I had only to show them once how a thing should be done, and they would fall to work by thousands to do it. Why, no sooner had we fashioned the first muzzle loader, and they had seen it work successfully, than fully 3,000 Mezops fell to work to make rifles. Of course there was much confusion and lost motion at first, but eventually Ja got them in hand, detailing squads of them under competent chiefs to certain work. We now have 100 expert gunmakers. On a little isolated isle we have a great powder factory. Near the iron mine, which is on the mainland, is a smelter, and on the eastern shore of Anarok a well-equipped shipyard. All these industries are guarded by forts in which several cannon are mounted, and where warriors are always on guard. You would be surprised now, David, at the aspect of Anarok. I am surprised myself. It seems always to me, as I compare it with the day that I first set foot upon it from the deck of the Sari, that only a miracle could have worked the change that has taken place." "It is a miracle," I said. "It is nothing short of a miracle to transplant all the wondrous possibilities of the 20th century back to the Stone Age. It is a miracle to think that only 500 miles of earth separate two epochs that are really ages and ages apart." "It is stupendous, Perry. But still more stupendous is the power that you and I wield in this great world. These people look upon us as little less than supermen. We must show them that we are all of that. We must give them the best that we have, Perry." "Yes," he agreed, "we must. I have been thinking a great deal lately that some kind of shrapnel shell or explosive bomb would be a most splendid innovation in their warfare. Then there are breech-loading rifles, and those with magazines that I must hasten to study out and learn to reproduce as soon as we get settled down again. And—" "Hold on, Perry," I cried. "I didn't mean these sorts of things at all. I said that we must give them the best we have. What we have given them so far has been the worst. We have given them war and the munitions of war. In a single day we have made their wars infinitely more terrible and bloody than in all their past ages they have been able to make them with their crude, primitive weapons. In a period that could scarcely have exceeded 2 outer earthly hours, our fleet practically annihilated the largest armada of native canoes that the Pellucidarians ever before had gathered together. We butchered some 8,000 warriors with the 20th century gifts we brought. Why, they wouldn't have killed that many warriors in the entire duration of a dozen of their wars with their own weapons. No, Perry, We've got to give them something better than scientific methods of killing one another." The old man looked at me in amazement. There was reproach in his eyes, too. "Why, David," he said sorrowfully, "I thought that you would be pleased with what I had done. We planned these things together, and I am sure that it was you who suggested practically all of it. I have done only what I thought you wished done, and I have done it the best that I know how." I laid my hand on the old man's shoulder. "Bless your heart, Perry," I cried. "You've accomplished miracles. You have done precisely what I should have done, only you've done it better. I'm not finding fault, but I don't wish to lose sight myself, or let you lose sight of the greater work which must grow out of this preliminary and necessary carnage. First, we must place the empire upon a secure footing, and we can do so only by putting the fear of us in the hearts of our enemies. But after that, ah, Perry, that is the day I look forward to, when you and I can build sewing machines instead of battleships, harvesters of crops instead of harvesters of men, plowshares and telephones, schools and colleges, printing presses and paper; when our merchant marine shall ply the great Pellucidarian seas, and cargoes of silks and typewriters and books shall forge their ways where only hideous saurians have held sway since time began." "Amen," said Perry, and Diane, who was standing at my side, pressed my hand. Chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 15. Conquest and Peace. The fleet sailed directly for Hooge's Island, coming to anchor at its northeastern extremity before the flat-topped hill that had been Hooge's stronghold. I sent one of the prisoners ashore to demand an immediate surrender, but as he told me afterward, they wouldn't believe all that he told them, so they congregated on the cliff top and shot futile arrows at us. In reply, I had 5 of the feluccas cannonade them. When they scampered away at the sound of the terrific explosions, and at sight of the smoke and the iron balls, I landed a couple of hundred red warriors and led them to the opposite end of the hill into the tunnel that ran to its summit. Here we met a little resistance, but a volley from the muzzle loaders turned back those who disputed our right of way, and presently we gained the mesa. Here again we met resistance, but at last the remnant of Hooge's horde surrendered. Juog was with me, and I lost no time in returning to him and his tribe the hilltop that had been their ancestral home for ages until they were robbed of it by Hooge. I created a kingdom of the island, making Juog king there. Before we sailed, I went to Gurgurgur, chief of the beast men, taking Juog with me. There the 3 of us arranged a code of laws that would permit the brute folk and the human beings of the island to live in peace and harmony. Gurgurgur sent his son with me back to Sari, capital of my empire, that he might learn the ways of the human beings. I have hopes of turning this race into the greatest agriculturists of Pellucidar. When I returned to the fleet, I found that one of the islanders of Juog's tribe, who had been absent when we arrived, had just returned from the mainland with the news that a great army was encamped in the land of awful shadow, and that they were threatening Thuria. I lost no time in weighing anchors and setting out for the continent, which we reached after a short and easy voyage. From the deck of the Amaz I scanned the shore through the glasses that Perry had brought with him. When we were close enough for the glasses to be of value, I saw that there was indeed a vast concourse of warriors entirely encircling the walled village of Gork, chief of the Thurians. As we approached, smaller objects became distinguishable. It was then that I discovered numerous flags and pennants floating above the army of the besiegers. I called Perry and passed the glasses to him. "Gok of Sari," I said. Perry looked through the lenses for a moment and then turned to me with a smile. "The red, white, and blue of the empire," he said. "It is indeed your Majesty's army." It soon became apparent that we had been sighted by those on shore, for a great multitude of warriors had congregated along the beach watching us. We came to anchor as close in as we dared, which with our light feluccas was within easy speaking distance of the shore. Gauke was there, and his eyes were mighty wide too, for as he told us later, though he knew this must be Perry's fleet, it was so wonderful to him that he could not believe the testimony of his own eyes even while he was watching it approach. To give the proper effect to our meeting, I commanded that each felucca fire 21 guns as a salute to His Majesty Gauke, King of Sari. Some of the gunners, in the exuberance of their enthusiasm, fired solid shot, but fortunately they had sufficient good judgment to train their pieces on the open sea, so no harm was done. After this we landed, an arduous task, since each felucca carried but a single light dugout. I learned from Gauke that the Thurian chieftain Gurk had been inclined to haughtiness, and had told Gauke, the hairy one, that he knew nothing of me and cared less; but I imagine that the sight of the fleet and the sound of the guns brought him to his senses, for it was not long before he sent a deputation to me, inviting me to visit him in his village. Here he apologized for the treatment he had accorded me, very gladly swore allegiance to the empire, and received in return the title of king. We remained in Thuria only long enough to arrange the treaty with Gurk, among the other details of which was his promise to furnish the imperial army with 1,000 lidi, or Thurian beasts of burden, and drivers for them. These were to accompany Gauke's army back to Sari by land, while the fleet sailed to the mouth of the great river from which Diane, Juag, and I had been blown. The voyage was uneventful. We found the river easily and sailed up it for many miles through as rich and wonderful a plain as I have ever seen. At the head of navigation we disembarked, leaving a sufficient guard for the feluccas, and marched the remaining distance to Sari. Gauke's army, which was composed of warriors of all the original tribes of the Federation, showing how successful had been his efforts to rehabilitate the empire, marched into Sari some time after we arrived. With them were the 1,000 lidi from Thuria. At a council of the kings it was decided that we should at once commence the great war against the Mahars, for these haughty reptiles presented the greatest obstacle to human progress within Pellucidar. I laid out a plan of campaign which met with the enthusiastic endorsement of the kings. Pursuant to it, I at once dispatched 50 lidi to the fleet, with orders to fetch 50 cannon to Sari. I also ordered the fleet to proceed at once to Anauroch, where they were to take aboard all the rifles and ammunition that had been completed since their departure, and with a full complement of men to sail along the coast in an attempt to find a passage to the inland sea, near which lay the Mahars' buried city of Phutra. Ja was sure that a large and navigable river connected the Sea of Phutra with the Lural Az, and barring accident, the fleet would be before Phutra as soon as the land forces were. At last the great army started upon its march. There were warriors from every one of the federated kingdoms. All were armed either with bow and arrows or muzzle loaders, for nearly the entire Mezop contingent had been enlisted for this march, only sufficient having been left aboard the feluccas to man them properly. I divided the forces into divisions, regiments, battalions, companies, and even to platoons and sections, appointing the full complement of officers and non-commissioned officers. On the long march I schooled them in their duties, and as fast as one learned I sent him among the others as a teacher. Each regiment was made up of about 1,000 bowmen, and to each was temporarily attached a company of Mezop musketeers and a battery of artillery, the latter our naval guns, mounted upon the broad backs of the mighty lidi. There was also one full regiment of Mezop musketeers and a regiment of primitive spearmen. The rest of the lidi that we brought with us were used for baggage animals and to transport our women and children, for we had brought them with us, as it was our intention to march from one Mahar city to another until we had subdued every Mahar nation that menaced the safety of any kingdom of the empire. Before we reached the plain of Phutra, we were discovered by a company of Sagos, who at first stood to give battle, but upon seeing the vast numbers of our army, they turned and fled toward Phutra. The result of this was that when we came in sight of the 100 towers which marked the entrances to the buried city, we found a great army of Sagos and Mahars lined up to give us battle. At 1,000 yards we halted, and placing our artillery upon a slight eminence at either flank, we commenced to drop solid shot among them. Ja, who was chief artillery officer, was in command of this branch of the service, and he did some excellent work, for his Mezop gunners had become rather proficient by this time. The Sagos couldn't stand much of this sort of warfare, so they charged us, yelling like fiends. We let them come quite close, and then the musketeers, who formed the first line, opened up on them. The slaughter was something frightful, but still the remnants of them kept on coming until it was a matter of hand-to-hand fighting. Here our spearmen were of value, as were also the crude iron swords with which most of the imperial warriors were armed. We lost heavily in the encounter after the Sagos reached us, but they were absolutely exterminated. Not one remained, even as a prisoner. The Mahars, seeing how the battle was going, had hastened to the safety of their buried city. When we had overcome their gorilla men, we followed after them. But here we were doomed to defeat, at least temporarily, for no sooner had the first of our troops descended into the subterranean avenues than many of them came stumbling and fighting their way back to the surface, half choked by the fumes of some deadly gas that the reptiles had liberated upon them. We lost a number of men here. Then I sent for Perry, who had remained discreetly in the rear, and had him construct a little affair that I had had in my mind against the possibility of our meeting with a check at the entrances to the underground city. Under my direction he stuffed one of his cannon full of powder, small bullets and pieces of stone almost to the muzzle. Then he plugged the muzzle tight with a cone-shaped block of wood, hammered and jammed it in as tight as it could be. Next he inserted a long fuse. A dozen men rolled the cannon to the top of the stairs leading down into the city, first removing it from its carriage. One of them then lit the fuse, and the whole thing was given a shove down the stairway, while the detachment turned and scampered to a safe distance. For what seemed a very long time, nothing happened. We had commenced to think that the fuse had been put out while the piece was rolling down the stairway, or that the Mahars had guessed its purpose and extinguished it themselves, when the ground about the entrance rose suddenly into the air, to be followed by a terrific explosion and a burst of smoke and flame that shot high in company with dirt, stone and fragments of cannon. Perry had been working on two more of these giant bombs as soon as the first was completed. Presently we launched these into two of the other entrances. They were all that were required, for almost immediately after the third explosion a stream of Mahars broke from the exits furthest from us, rose upon their wings and soared northward. 100 men on lidi were dispatched in pursuit, each lidi carrying 2 riflemen in addition to its driver. Guessing that the inland sea, which lay not far north of Phutra, was their destination, I took a couple of regiments and followed. A low ridge intervenes between the Phutra plain, where the city lies, and the inland sea where the Mahars were wont to disport themselves in the cool waters. Not until we had topped this ridge did we get a view of the sea. Then we beheld a scene that I shall never forget so long as I may live. Along the beach were lined up the troop of lidi, while 100 yards from shore the surface of the water was black with the long snouts and cold reptilian eyes of the Mahars. Our savage Mezop riflemen and the shorter, squatter, white-skinned Thurian drivers, shading their eyes with their hands, were gazing seaward beyond the Mahars, whose eyes were fastened upon the same spot. My heart leaped when I discovered that which was chaining the attention of them all. 20 graceful feluccas were moving smoothly across the waters of the sea toward the reptilian horde. The sight must have filled the Mahars with awe and consternation, for never had they seen the like of these craft before. For a time they seemed unable to do aught but gaze at the approaching fleet, but when the Mezops opened on them with their muskets, the reptiles swam rapidly in the direction of the feluccas, evidently thinking that these would prove the easier to overcome. The commander of the fleet permitted them to approach within 100 yards. Then he opened on them with all the cannon that could be brought to bear, as well as with the small arms of the sailors. A great many of the reptiles were killed at the first volley. They wavered for a moment, then dived, nor did we see them again for a long time. But finally they rose far out beyond the fleet, and when the feluccas came about and pursued them, they left the water and flew away toward the north. Following the fall of Phutra, I visited Anauroch, where I found the people busy in the shipyards and the factories that Perry had established. I discovered something too that he had not told me of, something that seemed infinitely more promising than the powder factory or the arsenal. It was a young man poring over one of the books I had brought back from the outer world. He was sitting in the log cabin that Perry had had built to serve as his sleeping quarters and office. So absorbed was he that he did not notice our entrance. Perry saw the look of astonishment in my eyes and smiled. "I started teaching him the alphabet when we first reached the prospector, and were taking out its contents," he explained. "He was much mystified by the books and anxious to know of what use they were. When I explained, he asked me to teach him to read, and so I worked with him whenever I could. He is very intelligent and learns quickly. Before I left, he had made great progress, and as soon as he is qualified, he is going to teach others to read. It was mighty hard work getting started, though, for everything had to be translated into Pellucidarian. It will take a long time to solve this problem, but I think that by teaching a number of them to read and write English, we shall then be able more quickly to give them a written language of their own." And this was the nucleus about which we were to build our great system of schools and colleges. This almost naked red warrior sitting in Perry's little cabin upon the island of Anauroch, picking out words letter by letter from a work on intensive farming. Now we have... but I'll get to all that before I finish. While we were at Anauroch, I accompanied Ja in an expedition to South Island, the southernmost of the 3 largest which form the Anauroch group. Perry had given it its name, where we made peace with the tribe there that had for long been hostile toward Ja. They were now glad enough to make friends with him and come into the federation. From there we sailed with 65 feluccas for distant Luana, the main island of the group where dwell the hereditary enemies of Anauroch. 25 of the feluccas were of a new and larger type than those with which Ja and Perry had sailed on the occasion when they chanced to find and rescue Diane and me. They were longer, carried much larger sails, and were considerably swifter. Each carried 4 guns instead of 2, and these were so arranged that one or more of them could be brought into action no matter where the enemy lay. The Luana group lies just beyond the range of vision from the mainland. The largest island of it alone is visible from Anauroch, but when we neared it, we found that it comprised many beautiful islands, and that they were thickly populated. The Luanians had not, of course, been ignorant of all that had been going on in the domains of their nearest and dearest enemies. They knew of our feluccas and our guns, for several of their riding parties had had a taste of both, but their principal chief, an old man, had never seen either. So when he sighted us, he put out to overwhelm us, bringing with him a fleet of about 100 large war canoes, loaded to capacity with javelin-armed warriors. It was pitiful, and I told Ja as much. It seemed a shame to massacre these poor fellows if there was any way out of it. To my surprise, Ja felt much as I did. He said he had always hated to war with other Mezops when there were so many alien races to fight against. I suggested that we hail the chief and request a parley, but when Ja did so, the old fool thought that we were afraid, and with loud cries of exultation urged his warriors upon us. So we opened up on them, but at my suggestion centered our fire upon the chief's canoe. The result was that in about 30 seconds there was nothing left of that war dugout but a handful of splinters, while its crew, those who were not killed, were struggling in the water, battling with the myriad terrible creatures that had risen to devour them. We saved some of them, but the majority died just as had Hooja and the crew of his canoe that time our second shot capsized them. Again we called to the remaining warriors to enter into a parley with us, but the chief's son was there, and he would not, now that he had seen his father killed. He was all for revenge, so we had to open up on the brave fellows with all our guns. But it didn't last long at that, for there chanced to be wiser heads among the Luanians than their chief or his son had possessed. Presently an old warrior who commanded one of the dugouts surrendered. After that they came in one by one until all had laid their weapons upon our decks. Then we called together upon the flagship all our captains, to give the affair greater weight and dignity, and all the principal men of Luana. We had conquered them, and they expected either death or slavery, but they deserved neither, and I told them so. It is always my habit here in Pellucidar to impress upon these savage people that mercy is as noble a quality as physical bravery, and that next to the men who fight shoulder to shoulder with one, we should honor the brave men who fight against us, and if we are victorious, award them both the mercy and honor that are their due. By adhering to this policy, I have won to the Federation many great and noble peoples, who under the ancient traditions of the inner world would have been massacred or enslaved after we had conquered them. And thus I won the Luanians. I gave them their freedom, and returned their weapons to them after they had sworn loyal to me and friendship and peace with Ja. And I made the old fellow who had had the good sense to surrender king of Luana, for both the old chief and his only son had died in the battle. When I sailed away from Luana, she was included among the kingdoms of the empire, whose boundaries were thus pushed eastward several hundred miles. We now returned to Anoroc and thence to the mainland, where I again took up the campaign against the Mahars, marching from one great buried city to another until we had passed far north of Amos into a country where I had never been. At each city we were victorious, killing or capturing the Sagoths and driving the Mahars further away. I noticed that they always fled toward the north. The Sagoth prisoners we usually found quite ready to transfer their allegiance to us, for they are little more than brutes, and when they found that we could fill their stomachs and give them plenty of fighting, they were nothing loath to march with us against the next Mahar city and battle with men of their own race. Thus we proceeded, swinging in a great half circle north and west and south again until we had come back to the edge of the Lidi plains north of Thuria. Here we overcame the Mahar city that had ravaged the land of awful shadow for so many ages. When we marched on to Thuria, Gurk and his people went mad with joy at the tidings we brought them. During this long march of conquest we had passed through 7 countries, peopled by primitive human tribes who had not yet heard of the Federation, and succeeded in joining them all to the empire. It was noticeable that each of these peoples had a Mahar city situated near by, which had drawn upon them for slaves and human food for so many ages that not even in legend had the population any folk tale which did not in some degree reflect an inherent terror of the reptilians. In each of these countries I left an officer and warriors to train them in military discipline and prepare them to receive the arms that I intended furnishing them as rapidly as Perry's arsenal could turn them out, for we felt that it would be a long, long time before we should see the last of the Mahars. That they had flown north but temporarily, until we should be gone with our great army and terrifying guns, I was positive, and equally sure was I that they would presently return. The task of ridding Pellucidar of these hideous creatures is one which in all probability will never be entirely completed, for their great cities must abound by the hundreds and thousands of the far distant lands that no subject of the empire has ever laid eyes upon. But within the present boundaries of my domain there are now none left that I know of, for I am sure we should have heard indirectly of any great Mahar city that had escaped us, although of course the imperial army has by no means covered the vast area which I now rule. After leaving Thuria, we returned to Sari, where the seat of government is located. Here, upon a vast fertile plateau overlooking the great gulf that runs into the continent from the Lural Az, we are building the great city of Sari. Here we are erecting mills and factories. Here we are teaching men and women the rudiments of agriculture. Here Perry has built the first printing press, and a dozen young Sarians are teaching their fellows to read and write the language of Pellucidar. We have just laws, and only a few of them. Our people are happy because they are always working at something which they enjoy. There is no money, nor is any money value placed upon any commodity. Perry and I were as one in resolving that the root of all evil should not be introduced into Pellucidar while we lived. A man may exchange that which he produces for something which he desires that another has produced, but he cannot dispose of the thing he thus acquires. In other words, a commodity ceases to have pecuniary value the instant that it passes out of the hands of its producer. All excess reverts to government, and as this represents the production of the people as a government, government may dispose of it to other peoples in exchange for that which they produce. Thus we are establishing a trade between kingdoms, the profits from which go to the betterment of the people, to building factories for the manufacture of agricultural implements, and machinery for the various trades we are gradually teaching the people. Already Anauroch and Luana are vying with one another in the excellence of the ships they build. Each has several large shipyards. Anauroch makes gunpowder and mines iron ore, and by means of their ships they carry on a very lucrative trade with Thuria, Sari, and Amoz. The Thurians breed lidi, which, having the strength and intelligence of an elephant, make excellent draught animals. Around Sari and Amoz the men are domesticating the great striped antelope, the meat of which is most delicious. I am sure that it will not be long before they will have them broken to harness and saddle. The horses of Pellucidar are far too diminutive for such uses, some species of them being little larger than fox terriers. Diane and I live in a great palace overlooking the gulf. There is no glass in our windows, for we have no windows, the walls rising but a few feet above the floor line, the rest of the space being open to the ceilings, but we have a roof to shade us from the perpetual noonday sun. Perry and I decided to set a style in architecture that would not curse future generations with the white plague, so we have plenty of ventilation. Those of the people who prefer still inhabit their caves, but many are building houses similar to ours. At Greenwich we have located a town and an observatory, though there is nothing to observe but the stationary sun directly overhead. Upon the edge of the land of awful shadow is another observatory from which the time is flashed by wireless to every corner of the empire 24 times a day. In addition to the wireless, we have a small telephone system in Sari. Everything is yet in the early stages of development, but with the science of the outer world 20th century to draw upon, we are making rapid progress, and with all the faults and errors of the outer world to guide us clear of dangers, I think that it will not be long before Pellucidar will become as nearly a utopia as one may expect to find this side of heaven. Perry is away just now, laying out a railway line from Sari to Amoz. There are immense anthracite coal fields at the head of the gulf not far from Sari, and the railway will tap these. Some of his students are working on a locomotive now. It will be a strange sight to see an iron horse puffing through the primeval jungles of the Stone Age, while cave bears, saber-toothed tigers, mastodons, and the countless other terrible creatures of the past look on from their tangled lairs in wide-eyed astonishment. We are very happy, Diane and I would not return to the outer world for all the riches of all its princes. I am content here. Even without my imperial powers and honors, I should be content. For have I not that greatest of all treasures, the love of a good woman, my wondrous empress, Diane the Beautiful? End of chapter 15. End of Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs.